She stepped into the moment with a calm confidence that belied the storm she was about to unleash. From the start, there was no hesitation in her tone, no softening of the blow. Every word was deliberate, measured, and laced with intent. She didn't posture or pontificate. She simply laid out facts, one after another, like a seasoned prosecutor laying out a case before a jury. Her voice didn't rise with anger, it carried weight through precision. It was a masterclass in controlled power. The audience leaned in. What started as a typical political exchange quickly took a turn. She began unpacking a series of allegations and inconsistencies that had long simmered beneath the surface. She talked about moral contradictions, about how values that were once screamed from the rooftops were now conveniently ignored. She questioned the shifting standards, the selective outrage, and the way some people in power pretend not to see what's right in front of them. She referenced court records and public documents, not gossip, not rumors, but verified information. She described the money trails, the settlements, the confessions embedded within carefully worded legal agreements. There was no need for speculation. The truth, she suggested, wasn't buried. It had just been ignored by those too loyal or too afraid to confront it. What made the moment so cutting wasn't just the information itself, but the way she delivered it. There was no shouting. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She simply laid down one undeniable point after another, and with each line you could feel the room shift. The smug grins disappeared. The comebacks stopped mid-formulation. Silence settled in the space where spin had lived seconds before. Her tone remained almost surgical, like someone dismantling a machine with a quiet precision. There were no personal attacks, only accountability. She wasn't there to entertain or perform. She was there to hold a mirror up to a system that had grown comfortable with contradictions. She spoke for the people who had watched, frustrated, as excuses piled higher than consequences. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when her counterpart seemed to lose footing. You could see the hesitation, the scrambling for a counterpoint that simply wasn't there. It was the kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes the facts are undeniable. Not only was there no comeback, but there wasn't even the illusion of one. The defense strategy had collapsed. And still, she didn't gloat. There was no trace of satisfaction on her face, only purpose. This wasn't about scoring points, it was about piercing through a fog of denial. She spoke of integrity not as a slogan, but as a standard, and she asked implicitly and explicitly, where is that standard now? Where was it when those in power made decisions that betrayed the very values they claimed to protect? She pointed to the silence of former allies, to the sudden amnesia of people who once insisted on truth and character above all else. She asked why they were so willing to look the other way, to excuse behaviors they'd once condemned in others. She reminded them, and everyone watching, that the truth doesn't change based on who benefits from the lie. It was a moment of political theater transformed into something deeper, a reckoning, not just with one individual's choices, but with a broader culture of double standards. She didn't need to name names to make her point. The weight of what she said lingered in the air, undeniable and heavy. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need volume to be loud. Her calm, steady voice was louder than any shout. The absence was louder than any speech, louder than any defense that could have been offered. It wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. There she was, completely missing from the conversation, from the courtroom, from the headlines that screamed with scandal. And the silence begged the question, why? Why now at a moment when support, public or personal, could have shifted the narrative? Did she choose distance? Or was it not a choice at all? Speculation swirled, as it always does. But what set this situation apart was how carefully orchestrated the absence appeared to be. This wasn't the kind of disappearance that happens out of embarrassment or shame alone. It felt tactical, intentional. Like a retreat, but also a statement. A refusal, maybe. And when someone who once stood center stage goes quiet in the middle of a public storm, people notice. More importantly, they start to wonder what's really being said in that silence. She had once been a figure of loyalty, often seen beside him, her expression composed, her presence calculated. Whether it was obligation or devotion, no one could say for sure. But now, in the face of mounting controversy, that poised image had vanished. And that vacuum, her withdrawal, invited analysis. It became impossible not to see it as a form of quiet resistance, or at the very least, self-preservation. There's power in silence, but also consequence. In this case, it became a Rorschach test. Some interpreted her absence as protest, an unspoken disapproval that couldn't be voiced without causing even more chaos. Others viewed it as strategic detachment, an effort to preserve personal reputation, while the headlines got uglier by the day. Then there were those who saw heartbreak in it, a woman tired of being dragged into battles she didn't start and couldn't control. No matter the theory, the truth remained that her disappearance spoke volumes, and it was brought to light in a way that was sharp and deliberate. The question wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was delivered with the kind of calm that forces people to listen. Where is she? That simple query lingered in the air, unanswered and undeniable. The implication was clear. If everything was as clean and righteous as some claimed, then why the need for silence? The absence went beyond optics. It undercut the narrative being sold to the public. You can't preach unity and loyalty while the most visible symbol of those ideals steps out of the frame. It felt like the unraveling of a script, a moment where reality slipped through the polish of a well-managed image. Her lack of presence challenged the notion that everything was fine, that nothing was wrong. In this silence, the cracks in the foundation became visible. The once glossy surface of a carefully curated relationship now seemed brittle, fragile. And in that fragility, the audience began to see something deeper, the tension between public obligation and private conviction. The silence wasn't just about physical distance, it was about moral space. How far do you have to step away before it becomes clear that you no longer endorse what's happening? This idea struck hard when raised on live television. The host or the opposing speaker might have been ready for political jabs, for partisan spin, but they weren't ready for the emotional weight of that question. It wasn't just a political point, it was human. It asked the audience to consider the personal costs of standing by someone when everything around them crumbles. And it suggested that maybe silence wasn't just an escape, maybe it was the most honest response anyone had given yet. The elegance of the argument lay in its restraint. There was no need to insult, to shout, or to accuse. The silence of someone who had once stood so visibly beside him was more powerful than any verbal defense. It became a character witness in reverse, not by what was said, but by what wasn't. And the one who brought attention to that silence knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't press the issue with force, but with clarity. She let the audience arrive at their own conclusions, and they did. The camera didn't need to cut to reactions to confirm the impact. You could feel it. The room shifted. What was supposed to be a routine defense turned into a moment of reckoning, not through confrontation, but through the undeniable weight of someone choosing to disappear when she came in prepared, rehearsed, and ready to play her role. She had her talking points memorized, her tone polished, and the same confident smirk that usually accompanied her sound bites. For a moment, it looked like it would go as planned. Another quick exchange where she'd rattle off a few rehearsed lines, deflect with a laugh, and walk away untouched. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't met with deference or polite disagreement. She was met with someone who had absolutely no intention of letting the usual spin fly by unchallenged. As she launched into her defense, the first few lines came out smoothly. She leaned into the usual rhetoric, hoping to provoke an emotional reaction or at least knock her opponent off balance. But what she didn't expect was the calm, pointed and unflinching response that came back at her like a perfectly placed counterpunch. There was no shouting match, no mudslinging, just facts. Delivered cold, delivered clearly. And with each word, the space she occupied shrank just a little more. It started subtly. Her opponent challenged her first claim, not with opinion but with documented evidence. A contradiction was exposed. A timeline didn't add up. A quote was read back to her verbatim. It was the kind of response that couldn't be brushed off with charm or sarcasm. It required a real answer. And when she didn't have one, she tried to pivot. But the pivot was met with more precision, more clarity, more receipts. What had started as confident posturing was quickly turning into a visible struggle. Her eyes flicked downward, then sideways. Her speech began to stammer. Her responses slower, as if she were searching for a trapdoor to escape the line of fire. But there was none. She had walked into this room expecting to control the narrative, only to find herself cornered by facts too solid to ignore. And it wasn't just about being wrong. It was about being unprepared for someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Her opponent didn't rely on volume to make a point. They relied on consistency, on evidence, and on the ability to see through the talking points for what they were. She was being held accountable in real time, on live television, in front of an audience that could see everything. The silence after each rebuttal was the most telling part. She tried to recover, tried to push forward, but each attempt was met with an even more damning counter. And that's when it happened. The look. That unmistakable moment when someone realizes that the argument is over, even if the conversation isn't. She knew it. The camera caught it. The audience saw it. That flicker of hesitation, the forced smile, the shallow breaths, it all said the same thing. She wasn't ready for this. And yet, the person across from her didn't gloat. There were no smug grins or cheap digs, just a quiet certainty in the truth being laid bare. That, more than anything, seemed to strip away the last defenses she had. Because when someone doesn't fight dirty, when they don't fall into the trap of spectacle, it becomes impossible to paint them as aggressive or unreasonable. It forces the audience to focus on the substance. By the time the segment ended, she wasn't saying much. The sound bites had run dry. The slogans felt flat. Her usual rhythm was gone. She had entered the conversation as someone used to winning, by repetition. But this wasn't a room where that strategy worked. This was a space where facts lived, where memory mattered, where dodging got you nowhere. The final moments played out like a quiet unraveling. She nodded along as her opponent wrapped up, her face trying to mask what her posture betrayed. No words left to lean on, no applause. Just the weight of a moment where she wasn't just out-argued, she was exposed. Not by volume, not by insult, but by truth calmly spoken that left her with nothing to say. The clip was barely a few minutes long, but that was all it took. It started circulating within moments of airing, bouncing from one platform to the next with increasing speed. What had begun as just another segment on political television quickly transformed into a viral moment, one of those rare events that crosses the usual divides and forces people to pay attention. It wasn't just the content of what was said, but the way it was said, calm, precise, unbothered by the theatrics that usually dominate televised debate, and that clarity resonated strongly. People started posting the moment with captions like, "Finally someone said it," or "This is how you handle spin." The responses weren't driven by party loyalty or blind allegiance. They came from a place of frustration finally finding voice. For months, years even, many had watched debates devolve into shouting matches or watched misinformation slide by unchecked. But this was different. This was someone standing firmly in facts, refusing to let the usual games continue unchecked, and doing it with poise that cut deeper than any insult ever could. The comments flooded in. On Twitter, the clip hit millions of views within hours. TikTok creators started breaking down the speech, second by second, praising the delivery, the substance, the composure. On Instagram, short reels took the most impactful lines and set them to music, transforming the moment into something even more powerful, a rallying cry. It wasn't just a trending topic, it was a cultural pulse point. What made it so compelling wasn't that it was flashy or theatrical. In fact, it was the opposite. It was restrained, and that restraint gave the truth more room to breathe. There were no shouting matches, no over-the-top gestures, just a controlled dismantling of falsehoods, a refusal to let empty rhetoric stand unchallenged. And that kind of discipline, especially in a chaotic media landscape, stood out like a spotlight in darkness. Young viewers especially took notice. For them, authenticity is currency, and this moment didn't feel staged or strategic. It felt earned. It didn't rely on political jargon or overcomplicated policy talk. It was plain, accessible, and rooted in lived reality. That honesty, delivered without condescension or fear, gave the moment legs. It moved through generations, shared by parents who couldn't believe someone finally had the courage to say what they were thinking, and by students who saw in that voice the kind of leadership they craved. News outlets quickly picked it up. What began as a simple clip became headline-worthy. Op-eds started appearing, analyzing not just what was said, but what it meant in the larger context of political discourse. They noted how the speaker didn't resort to personal attacks, didn't get flustered, and didn't back down. That combination of composure and courage felt rare and badly needed. Even those who disagreed politically couldn't deny the strength of the moment. Some criticized it, of course, but even within the critique there was a reluctant respect. You could sense it in the tone. The recognition that, agree or not, this person showed up with substance, not spectacle. And substance has a way of lingering, especially when it's delivered without the usual performance. Memes followed, but not the mocking kind. These were celebratory, bold fonts, freeze-frame reactions, catchphrases pulled from the speech. It became part of the online lexicon, the kind of reference people drop into conversations when they want to convey calm dominance in a debate. Even public figures started sharing the clip, not just activists or commentators, but celebrities, artists, writers, people who saw in the moment a glimpse of something honest in a space usually crowded with noise. What had begun as a single confrontation turned into a digital movement. A reminder of what real leadership looks like when it isn't afraid of the truth. It wasn't just about calling someone out, it was about restoring the balance in a conversation that had long since lost its grounding. And that's why it spread, not because it was shocking, but because it was clear. It cut through the noise, not with volume, but with precision. And precision, when wielded well, becomes unforgettable. In the end, what made the moment so unforgettable wasn't just the facts that were laid out, the calm dismantling of falsehoods, or the piercing questions that silenced spin. It was the shift it created. People watching didn't just witness a political exchange. They experienced a rare and honest confrontation with truth in a space that's so often dominated by evasion, performance, and noise. It reminded viewers that integrity doesn't need to shout. When someone stands in their conviction with clarity and restraint, it echoes louder than 1,000 empty slogans. This wasn't just about exposing contradictions or calling out the absence of accountability. It was a reclamation of space, and assertion that facts still matter, that the public still deserves honesty, and that leadership must be earned, not just claimed. In an era when so many have grown numb to the chaos of political theater, the simplicity of composure and the sharpness of truth landed like a thunderclap. You could see it on social media, in the way people engaged not just with the moment, but with each other, sharing, analyzing, finally feeling like someone had said what needed to be said. More than a viral moment, it became a measuring stick. It set a new standard for what political discourse could be if stripped of its usual vanity. The reaction wasn't just admiration, it was relief. Relief that someone had the courage to speak directly, to challenge hypocrisy without stooping, to hostility, and to do it in front of an audience that included both supporters and skeptics. The message wasn't tailored to win points. It was delivered to raise the standard. For the person left speechless, it was more than a moment of being out-argued. It was a public reckoning. And for those watching, it served as a powerful reminder. Silence in the face of truth isn't strength, it's exposure. The absence of a counterpoint doesn't mean there wasn't time to prepare. It means the truth was stronger than the narrative. It means the questions hit deeper than any prepared answer could reach. As the moment fades from the headlines, its impact will remain. Not just as a clip replayed online, but as a shift in the conversation. It reminded viewers that we still crave substance over spectacle, courage over calculation, and honesty over hollow defense. It proved that a single voice, grounded in truth and unafraid to challenge the comfortable lie, can still cut through the fog and force the world to stop. and listen. That, more than anything, is what made this moment matter.